Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Union Arena Battle. On the left, we have the Bleach anime main character Toshiro and Kenpachi versus the right Yuji, Itadori, and our battlers Rochambeau to see who goes first. Second player taps an action point and plays a 0 energy cost Yuji Itadori into the energy line. Player 2 passes turn, player 1 draws a card and sets 2 action points. Player 1 taps an action point to play Toshiro onto the energy line. Tap second action point to play Retsu onto the energy line. Player 1 passes turn, player 2 draws a card, sets their second action point. Player 2 taps an action point and plays a 0 cost Gen P, allowing him to draw a card. Player 2 misfires, doesn't draw a card though. Taps an action point to play another Yuji Itadori onto the front line, but also doesn't use the effect. Player 2 passes turn to player 1. Player 1 draws a card and untaps action points. Player 1 taps an action point and plays a 0 cost Toshiro onto the energy line. Player 1 taps an action point to play another Toshiro onto the front line. Player 1 passes turn, player 2 draws a card and untaps action points. Player 2 taps an action point for an extra draw. Player 2 swings at player 1. Player 1 takes the damage. Player 1 has a trigger card from his life that allows him to draw a card. Player 2 ends turn. Player 1 untaps action points and draws a card starting their turn. Taps an action point and plays Squad Funeral. He gets to take a card from the sideline, remove it to draw 2 cards. Taps an action point to play a Toshiro onto the energy line. Player 1 taps an action point and plays a Daigorin, removing player 2's Yuji off the front line and sidelines it because Toshiro is on the field. Player 1 attacks player 2. Player 2 takes the damage. Player 2's life has a trigger allowing him to add the card to his hand, and if he has the required energy, he can perform a raid with it. Player 1 ends turn. Player 2 draws a card and untaps action points. Player 2 taps action point for extra draw. Player 2 taps an action point and plays a Megumi into the energy line. Player 2 taps an action point and plays Jujutsu Kaisen's First Years, which has an effect. Draw 3 cards, then place 2 cards from your hand into your sideline. Player 2 does it in reverse. We're still learning here. We're still novice at the game, but we're getting better. Player 2 passes turn. Player 1 draws a card and untaps action points. Player 1 taps 2 action points and plays Kenpachi onto the front line. Player 1 taps an action point to play another Squad Funeral. Player 1 attacks player 2. Player 2 takes the damage. Player 2 takes the damage. His life does have a trigger, but unfortunately, player 2 has no cards on the front line, so the trigger does not work. Player 1 ends turn. Player 2 draws a card and untaps action points. Player 2 taps an action point and plays a Yuji Itadori into the energy line. Player 2 taps another action point and plays another Yuji Itadori onto the front line. Player 1 taps an action point and performs a raid with Yuji Itadori onto the front line, moving it to active. When played, choose one character with 4,000 or less BP on your opponent's front line and return it to their hand. Player 2 select player 1's Kenpachi to return to hand. Player 2 attacks player 1 with Yuji Itadori. Player 1 takes the damage. Player 2 chooses which life. Player 1's life has a trigger. It is Toshiro, which allows him to play the card, add the card to his hand, play the card, and perform a raid if he has required energy. Player 1 performs the raid. Player 1's Toshiro's raid ability allows him to select the card on player 2's front line to remain rested and rest it until the end of their next turn. Player 2 ends turn. Player 1 draws a card, untaps action points, starting their turn. Player 1 taps action point, plays Toshiro onto the energy line. Player 1 taps 2 action points to play Kenpachi that when played, choose one character with 2,000 or less BP on your opponent's front line and sideline it. If 6 or more other 13 core card squads, affinity cards are on your field, 4,000 or less BP instead, player 1 chooses player 2's Yujori, sidelining it. Player 1 attacks player 2 with Toshiro, 4,000 BP. Player 1 takes the damage. The life has a trigger, allowing player 2 to draw a card. Player 1 attacks player 2 with his second Toshiro on the front line. Player 2 takes the damage. No trigger effect on player 2's life. Player 1 ends turn. Player 2 untaps action points and forgets to draw a card starting their turn. Player 2 taps an action point and plays a Sukuna's finger. Effect, you cannot use this card unless you place one card from your life into your sideline or switch one Yuji Itadori card on your field to rest in. Draw a card, choose one of your action point cards and switch it to active. Player 2 taps an action point and plays another Sukuna's finger. Player 2 taps an action point and performs a raid with Sukuna. During your turn, if you have one or more copies of Sukuna's finger in your sideline, the character gains 1,000 PP. If 2 or more copies in the sideline, the character gains impact. When played, draw 2 cards and place one card from your hand onto your sideline. Player 2 attacks with Sukuna. Player 1 takes the damage. Player 1's life has a trigger, allowing him to add this card to his hand. Player 2 ends turn. Player 1 draws a card and untaps action points. Player 1 taps 2 action points and plays Kenpachi. When played, choose up to one character, 2,000 or less BP on your opponent's front line and sideline it. If 6 or more 13 core cards, infinity cards are on your field, 4,000 or less BP instead. Player 1 chooses player 2's Sukuna, sidelines it. Player 1 attacks player 2. Player 2 life has a trigger, allowing him to draw a card. Player 1 swings at player 2 with the remaining 2 Toshiros. Player 2 takes the damage, unable to defend or do anything. No triggers help player 2. Bleach, Toshiro Kenpachi is the winner of this match.